The Milk Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore by Tennessee Williams. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. From Sailing to Byzantium by William Butler Yeats. Author's Notes. Sometimes theatrical effects and devices, such as those I have adopted in the third, and I hope final, version of this play, are ascribed to affectation or artiness. So it may be helpful for me to explain a bit of my intention in the use of these effects and devices, and let the play's production justify or condemn them. I have added to the cast a pair of stage assistants that function in a way that's between the Kabuki Theater of Japan and the chorus of Greek theater. My excuse, or reason, is that I think the play will come off better the further it is removed from conventional theater, since it's been rightly described as an allegory and as a sophisticated fairy tale. Stage assistants in Japanese kabuki are a theatrical expedient. They work on stage during the performance, shifting set pieces, placing and removing properties and furniture. Now and then in this play they have lines to speak, very short ones that serve as cues to the principal performers. They should be regarded, therefore, as members of the cast. They sometimes take a balletic part in the action of the play. They should be dressed in black, very simply, to represent invisibility to the other players. The other players should never appear to see them, even when they speak or take part in the action, except when they appear in costume. The setting represents the library and bedroom of the White Villa, downstage, and the bedrooms of the Pink and Blue Villinos. Most importantly, the terrace of the White Villa, I think, should extend the whole width of the proscenium, with a small apron for a white iron bench, a step down from the terrace. Separations between interior and exterior should not be clearly defined except by lighting. When a single interior is being used, the other interior areas should be masked by light, folding screens, painted to blend with the cyclorama, that is, in sea and sky colors. They should be set in place and removed by the stage assistants. The cyclorama and these folding screens represent, preferably in a semi-abstract style, the mountain sea sky of Italy's Divina Costeria in summer. Since the villas are naturally much further apart than they can appear on the stage, the director could adopt a convention of having actors who are to go from one villa to another make their exits into the wings. They would wait till the stage assistants have removed the screens that mask the next interior to be used and then come back out and enter that area. August 1963. The players: Mrs. Goforth, Christopher Flanders, Blackie, the Witch of Capri, Rudy, a watchman, Julio, Simonetta, two stage assistants, sometimes appearing in costume for small parts, members of the kitchen staff. Prologue. At the rise of the curtain, the stage assistants are on stage. All the interior areas are masked by their individual screens. The light of the cyclorama suggests early dawn. 1. Daybreak. Flag-raising ceremony on Mrs. Goforth's mountain. 2. Above the oldest sea in the Western world. 1. Banner. 2. Hands it to him. 2. Places the staff in a socket near the right wings and attaches the flag to it. A fan in the wings whips it out as it is being raised. so that the audience can see the device on it clearly. 1. The device on the banner is a golden griffin. 2. A mythological monster, half lion and half eagle. 1. And completely human. 2. Yes, wholly and completely human. That's true. 1. We are also a device. 2. A theatrical device of ancient and oriental origin. 1. With Occidental variations, however. Together, we are stage assistants. We move the screens that mask the interior playing areas of the stage presentation. 1. We fetch and carry. 2. Furniture and props. 1. To make the presentation, the play, or mask or pageant move more gracefully. Quickly through the course of the 2 final days of Mrs. Goforth's existence. Mrs. Goforth's voice, offstage, half sleeping. Ah, me. There is heard the sound of distant church bells. 1. The actors will not seem to hear us except when we're in costume. 2. They will never see us except when we're in costume. 1. Sometimes we will give them cues for speech and participate in the action. Mrs. Goforth's voice offstage. Ah, ah, ah. 1 and 2 show no reaction to this human cry. Mrs. Goforth's voice, offstage more wakefully. Another day. O Christ, O Mother of Christ. There is silence, a pause as the cyclorama's lighting indicates the progress of the day toward the meridian. 1 and 2 together. Our hearts are invisible, too. The fan that whipped out the flag bearing the personal emblem, the griffin, of Mrs. Goforth, dies down, and the flag subsides with it, and will not whip out again till the flag-lowering ceremony, which will take place during the last 3 lines of the play. Now it is noon. Electric buzzers sound from various points on the stage. The stage assistants cross rapidly up center and remove a screen, the middle panel of which is topped by Mrs. Goforth's heraldic device, the gold griffin. The library of the White Villa is unmasked, and the play begins. Scene 1. Mrs. Goforth and her secretary, Blackie, are on stage. Mrs. Goforth. I made my greatest mistake when I put a fast car in his hands. That Red Demon sports car. His fighting cock, I called it, which he drove insanely, recklessly, between my estate and the casino at Monte Carlo. So recklessly that the police commissioner of Monaco came personally to ask me. Correction, beg me. Correction, implore me to insist that he go with me in the rolls with a chauffeur at the wheel, as a protection of his life and of the lives of others. Monsieur le Commissionaire, I said, for me there are no others. I know, madam, he said, but for the others there are others. Then I confessed to the commissioner of the police that over this young poet with Romanov blood in his veins, I had no more control than my hands had over the sea wind or the storms of the sea. At night he had flying dreams. He would thrash his arms like wings, and once his hand, on which he wore a signet ring with the heavy Romanov crest, struck me in the mouth and drew blood. After that, necessarily, twin beds. Blackie. Mrs. Goforth, excuse me, but the last thing I have typed up is... Oh, here it is. My first 2 husbands were ugly as apes, and my third one resembled an ostrich. Now, if this passage you're dictating to me comes in direct sequence, it will sound as if you had put the fast car in the hands of the ostrich. There's a long, tempestuous pause. Mrs. Goforth. Aren't you the sly one? Oh, you're sly as 10 flies when you want to give me the needle, aren't you, Miss Blackie? My first 3 marriages were into Dun and Bradstreet's and the Social Register. Both. My first husband, Harlan Goforth, whose name I still carry after 3 later marriages, that dignified financier tycoon, was a man that presidents put next to their wives at banquets in the White House. And you sit there, smoking in my face, when you know I've been told to quit smoking. And you make a joke of my work with a deadpan expression on your Vassar girl face and your Vassar girl voice, and I will not tolerate it. You know goddamn well I'm talking about my 4th husband. The last one. The one I married for love. Who plunged off the Grand Corniche between Monte Carlo and died that night in my arms in a clinic at Nice. And my heart died with him. Forever. Her voice breaks. Blackie. I'm sorry, Mrs. Goforth. Puts out cigarette. I'm no writer, but I do think in writing there has to be some kind of logical sequence, continuity, between one bit and the next bit. And the last thing you dictated to me, Mrs. Goforth, was it something I put on the tape recorder in my bedroom after I'd been given one of those injections that upset my balance at night? Blackie, I took it off your bedroom tape this morning, Mrs. Goforth. Always check those night recordings with me before we begin to work the following morning. We're working against time, Blackie. Remember, try to remember. I've got 2 deadlines to meet, my New York publishers and my London publishers. Both have my memoirs on their fall list. I said fall. It's already late in August. Now do you see why there's no time for goofing, or must I draw you a picture of autumn leaves falling? Blackie. Mrs. Goforth, I think those publishers' deadlines are unrealistic, not to say cruel. And as for me, I not only have to function as a secretary, but as an editor. I have to collate the material you dictate to me, and I'm not being sly or cruel. I'm just being honest with you when I tell you, Mrs. Goforth, cutting in. All cruel people describe themselves as paragons of frankness. Blackie, I think we'd better stop now, Mrs. Goforth. I think we'd better go on, now. Blackie. Mrs. Goforth, the police commissioner of Monaco was right when he told you that there were others. I am one of those others. I've had no sleep, scarcely any at all, and Mrs. Goforth, you've had no sleep? What about me? How much sleep do I get? Blackie, you sleep till noon, or after. Mrs. Goforth, under sedation, with nightmares. Blackie, your broker is on the phone. The stage assistants have entered with phone. Mrs. Goforth, immediately brightening. Chuck, baby, how are we doing? Uh-huh. Glamour stock still slipping? Don't hold on to 'em. Dump 'em before they drop under what I bought 'em at, baby. We'll start buying back when they hit the basement level. Don't give me an argument. Sell. Sell. Hell. It's building into a crash. So, baby, I'm hitting the silk. High, low, jack in the game. Ho ho. She bangs down the phone, exhilarated, and it is removed by one of the stage assistants. The other assistant has rushed to the stage right wings, and he now appears in a white doctor's jacket. This is one of the costumes that make the assistant seen and heard by the other actors. Assistant as Dr. Lullo. Buongiorno, Mrs. Goforth. What's he wheeling in here that looks like a baby buggy for a baby from Mars? He is pushing a mock-up of a portable x-ray machine. Blackie. It's something your doctor in Rome, Dr. What? Ringucci? Had sent up here to spare you the trouble of interrupting your work to take a new set of pictures to show what progress there is in the healing of the lesion, the lung abscess that Mrs. Goforth. Oh, so you're having private consultations with that quack in Rome? Blackie. Just routine calls that he told me to make sure to spare you the trouble of. Mrs. Goforth. Spare me no trouble, just spare me your goddamn presumptions. Dr. Lulo. Forse pur tardi. Forse un po' poi tardi. Mrs. Goforth. Will you get your sneaky grin out of here? Va, presto. He retires quickly from the lighted area. Mrs. Goforth advances both fearfully and threateningly upon the medical apparatus. My outside is public, but my insides are private. And the Rome quack was hired by my bitch daughter that wants to hang crepe on me. Wants to know if I'm going and when I'll go. Doesn't know that if and when I do go, she gets $1. The rest goes to a cultural foundation named for me. Blackie, wheel this thing off the terrace to the cliffside of the mountain and shove it over. Blackie, Mrs. Goforth, you mustn't ask me to do ridiculous things. Mrs. Goforth, I don't do ridiculous things and don't ask anyone else to do them for me. But if you think it's ridiculous of me to show my opinion of Ranguchi's presumption and... Look, watch this. Here we go. Perambulator from Mars. Out, down, go. She thrusts it violently onto the forestage, where it is seized by the stage assistants and rushed into the wings. She crosses onto the forestage, leaning forward to watch its fall off the cliff. After a couple of moments, we hear a muted crash that signifies its destruction on the rocky beach under the mountain. Then she straightens dizzily with a fierce laugh and staggers back toward the library area, where Blackie, meanwhile, has closed her notebook and rushed offstage. Heartbeat sounds are heard amplified as Mrs. Goforth moves distractedly about the library area, calling out breathlessly for Blackie. She presses several buttons on the intercom box on the desk. Electric buzzers sound from here and there on the stage, but no one responds. She washes down a pill with a swig of brandy. The heartbeat sounds subside as her agitation passes. She sinks into the desk chair. She activates her tape recorder and speaks into it with a voice that is plaintively childlike. Blackie, the boss is sorry she took her nerves out on you. It's those night injections I take for my neuralgia, neuritis, bursitis, the pickup pills and the quiet down pills. Nerve shot. A sea wave booms under the mountain. Oh God, Blackie, I'm scared. You know what I'm scared of? Possibly maybe the boss is dying this summer on the Divina Costiera. Under that angry old lion, the sun, and the insincere sympathy of the... Her mood suddenly reverses again. No. I don't want her goddamn sympathy. I'll take that slobbery stuff off the tape and begin. Continue. Dictation. She rises, paces the forestage with a portable mic. A phrase of lyrical music is heard. She stops short, lifting a jeweled hand as if to say, listen. Then suddenly, the accretion of years is broken through. The stage dims out except for her follow spot on the forestage. Cloudy symbols of a high romance. Who said that? Where's that from? Check tomorrow, Blackie, in the Book of Familiar Quotations. Begin. Continue dictation. A pause while she paces back and forth. The love of true understanding isn't something a man brings up the road to you every day, or once in a blue moon even. But it was brought to me once. Almost too late, but not quite. The hard shell of my heart, the calcium deposits grown around it, could still be cracked, broken enough. And my last husband broke through it, and I was brought back to life, and almost back to, what? Youth. The nights. The nights. Especially the first one I spent with Alex. The way that a lover undresses, removes his clothes the first night you spend together is a clue. A definite clue to your whole future relationship with him. Alex unclothed himself unconsciously gracefully, as if before no one in a room made of windows, and then unclothed. Correction. Clothed in a God's perfection, his naked body. He went from window to window, all the way around the bedroom, drawing the curtains together so that daybreak beginning wouldn't wake us early from the sleep after love, which is a heavenly sleep that shouldn't be broken early. Then came to rest in a God's perfection beside me, reached up to turn off the light. I reached up and turned it back on. At this point, Mrs. Goforth's watchdogs, Lupos, set up a great clamor on the inland side of the mountain. A man shouts. Woman servants scream in Italian. Somebody calls, Rudy! Rudy! Mrs. Goforth is very annoyed by this disruption of her tender recollections. She presses various buttons on the intercom box on her desk. Mrs. Goforth, shouting over the dogs. Che succede? Che fa cretini, stronzi, etc. The savage barking continues but diminishes a little in volume as a young man who has just been assaulted by dogs limps and stumbles onto the terrace. He bears a heavy white sack over his shoulder, looking back as if to make sure he's no longer pursued. Blackie appears behind him, panting, looking as if she'd also been roughed up by the dogs. Blackie, to the young man. Places go mad. It's catching. People catch it. She draws a breath. There's a doctor up here. I'll get him for you. Chris. Can I see Mrs. Goforth? Blackie. Sit down somewhere. I'll see if she can see you, and I'll... The young man, Chris, limps out upon the forestage, sinks onto a white iron bench. A wave crashes below the mountain. He looks blankly out at the audience for a moment, then shakes his head and utters a desperate-sounding laugh. Blackie rushes into the library area. Mrs. Goforth, I can't stand this sort of thing. Mrs. Goforth, what? Blackie, those dogs of Rudy's, those wolves, attacked a young man just now. Mrs. Goforth, what young man? Doing what? Blackie, he was climbing to see you. Mrs. Goforth, who is he? What does he want? Blackie, I didn't stop to ask that. I had to drive the dogs off to keep him from being torn to pieces before I asked him questions. Look. She shows Mrs. Goforth a laceration on her thigh just over the knee. The others just watched and screamed like children at a circus. Mrs. Goforth, sit down. Have a brandy. A place like this is always protected by dogs. There is the sound of another wave crashing. Chris. Boom. He discovers that his leather pants, lederhosen, have been split down his thigh. Blackie. That gangster's bodyguard, Rudy, just stood there and watched. Mrs. Goforth. Blackie, this estate contains things appraised by Lloyd's at over £2 million sterling, besides my jewels and summer furs, and that's why it has to be guarded against trespassers, uninvited intruders. Have you had your anti-tetanus shot, or whatever they call it? Blackie. Yes. I'm all right, but he isn't. She presses a button on the intercom box. Mrs. Goforth. Who are you calling? Blackie. I'm calling Dr. Lillo. Mrs. Goforth. Stop that. Leave that to me. Do you think I want to be sued by this trespasser? Get away from my desk. I'm going to buzz Rudy. She presses another button. Rudy? Dove Rudy? Io lo voglio in libreria subito presto. Capito? The young man staggers to his feet and calls, Mrs. Goforth. Mrs. Goforth picks up a pair of binoculars and gazes out at the terrace. Blackie stares at her with consternation. Chris. Mrs. Goforth? Rudy, the watchman, in semi-military costume, appears on the terrace. Rudy. Shut up. Stop that shouting. He enters the library area. Mrs. Goforth. Aw, Rudy. What happened? What's the report? Rudy. I caught this man out there climbing up from the highway. Blackie. He set the dogs on him. Mrs. Goforth. That's what the dogs are here for. Rudy, what's the sign say on the gate on the highway? Rudy. Private property. Mrs. Goforth. Just private property, not beware of dogs? Rudy. There's nothing about dogs down there. Mrs. Goforth. Well, for Christ's sake, put up beware of dogs too. Put it up right away. If this man sues me, I've got to prove there was a beware of dogs sign. Blackie. How can you prove what's not true? Mrs. Goforth to Rudy. Go on, hurry up. Rudy leaves. Mrs. Goforth to Blackie. Now pull yourself together. What a day. It's too much for me. I'll have to go back to bed. Julio, the gardener's son, a boy of 17, appears on the terrace. Julio, to the young man who is applying an antiseptic to his lacerations. Come va? Meglio? Chris. Si, meglio. Grazie. Do you understand English? Julio. Yes, English. Chris. Good. Would you please tell Mrs. Goforth that Mr. Christopher Flanders is here to see her and... Oh, give her this book. There's a letter in it. And ask her if I may see her. Don't mention the dogs. Just say I want very much to see her if she's willing to see me. During this exchange on the forestage, Mrs. Goforth has picked up a pair of binoculars. Julio knocks at the screen that represents the door between the terrace and the library. Mrs. Goforth. Come in, avanti. The boy enters excitedly. Julio. Man, bring this up the road. Man, bring this up road. Mrs. Goforth, gingerly accepting the book in her hand. Young man, that dog's bite. Bring this squinset book to me. Julio. This brings up mountains. She turns the book and squints at a photograph of the author. Mrs. Goforth. Man resemble this photo? Blackie is still quietly weeping at the desk. Julio. Non capisco. Mrs. Goforth. Man, uomo, resemble. Look like this photo. Julio. Yes, this man. This man that dogs bite on mountain. Points out excitedly toward the young man on the bench. Mrs. Goforth. Well, go back out. Vada fiore e dica. Blackie. Tell him to go back out there and say that I am very upset over the accident with the dogs, but that I would like to know why he came here without invitation, and that I am not responsible for anybody that comes here without invitation. Blackie, strongly as she rises. No, I will not. I will not give a man nearly killed by dogs such an inhuman message. Mrs. Goforth. He hasn't been seriously hurt. He's standing up now. Listen, he's shouting my name. The young man has called Mrs. Goforth in a hoarse, panting voice. His shirt and one leg of his lederhosen have been nearly stripped off him. He has the opposite appearance to that which is ordinarily encountered in poets as they are popularly imagined. His appearance is rough and weathered, his eyes wild, haggard. He has the look of a powerful, battered, but still undefeated fighter. Chris. Mrs. Goforth. His call is almost imperious. A wave crashes under the mountain. Chris closes his eyes, opens them, crosses to the lounge chair on the terrace and throws himself down in it, dropping a large canvas sack on the terrace tiles. The excited, distant barking of the dogs has now died out. Female voices are still heard exclaiming at a distance in Italian. Mrs. Goforth, looking again through her binoculars. Pull yourself together. The continent has been overrun by beatniks lately. I've been besieged by them, Blackie. Writers that don't write, painters that don't paint. A bunch of freeloaders, Blackie. They come over here on a Slavian freighter with about $100 in traveler's checks and the summer addresses of everybody they think they can freeload on. That's why I'm not so sympathetic to them. Look, I made it. I got it because I made it. But they'll never work for a living as long as there is a name on their sucker list, Blackie. Now, cut the hysterics now and go out there and... Blackie. What? Mrs. Goforth. Interrogate him for me. Blackie. Interrogate? A badly injured young man? Mrs. Goforth. Trespasser. Get that straight in case he tries to sue me. She continues inspecting him through the binoculars. He's not bad looking, in a wild sort of way, but I'm afraid he's a beatnik. He has a beard and looks like he hasn't seen water for bathing purposes in a couple of weeks. Blackie. You would too if a pack of wild dogs had attacked you. Mrs. Goforth. Watch dogs. Lupos. Defending private property. Get that straight. He has on lederhosen. The first time I saw Alex in the Bavarian Alps, he had on lederhosen, and the right legs for him too. And it's odd. It's a coincidence that I was dictating some recollections of Alex, who was a poet, when this young trespasser got here. Now, if the sweat and the filthy appearance just come from the dogs' attack on him, I mean, from meeting the dogs, you can tell by the smell of him while you're talking to him. Blackie. You want me to go out and smell him? I'm not a dog, Mrs. Goforth. Mrs. Goforth. You don't have to be a dog to smell a beatnik. Sometimes they smell to high heaven because not washing is almost a religion with them. Or last summer, one of those ones you see in The Life and the Look came up here. I had to talk to him with a handkerchief held to my nose. It was a short conversation and the last one between us. Chris staggers up from the lounge chair and shouts, Mrs. Goforth! Mrs. Goforth, what impudence, going on shouting at me like that. Blackie. I think the least you could do is go out there yourself and show some decent concern over the dogs' attack on him. Mrs. Goforth. I'm not going to see him till I've checked with my lawyers about my liability, if any. So be a good scout, a nice brownie den mother, and go out there and... Blackie. Interrogate him? Mrs. Goforth. Ask him politely what he wants here, why he came to see me without invitation, and if you get the right answers, put him in the pink Villano. And I'll see him later, after my siesta. He might be okay for a while, and I could use some male companionship up here since all I've got is you and Generalissimo Rudy for company this summer. I do need male company, Blackie. That's what I need to be me, the old sissy Goforth. High, low, Jack in the game. Blackie. I'll go see if he's seriously hurt. She crosses out to the terrace and approaches Chris limping about the forestage. Blackie to Chris. How are you? Are you all right now? Chris. Not all right, but better. Could I see Mrs. Goforth? Blackie. Not yet. Not right now, but she told me to put you in the little pink guest house, if you can. Walk a little. It's a little way down the mountain. Chris. Well, thank God. And he tries to lift his sack and stumbles under its weight. Mrs. Goforth, of course. Blackie, calling. Julio, vieni qui. Julio comes onto the terrace. Blackie. Porta questo sacco al velino rosa. Julio, lifting sack. Pesante, Dio. Blackie. Tu sei pesante nella testa. Then to Chris. You can bathe and rest till Mrs. Goforth feels better and is ready to see you. Chris. Oh, thanks. He follows her off the terrace. The stage assistants fold and remove the screen masking a bed upstage. The bed is small but rococo and all pink. The stage assistants return downstage with the screen and wait near Mrs. Goforth, who was still watching the terrace scene through her binoculars. Mrs. Goforth, to herself, "Oh, God," raises a hand unconsciously to a pain in her chest. The stage assistants unfold the screen before her as the library area is dimmed out. Scene 2. The area representing the pink Velino is lighted. The light is warm gold afternoon light and striated as if coming through half-open shutters. A cupid is lowered over the bed by a wire. There are smaller cupids on the four posts of the bed. Blackie, Chris, and Julio enter the narrow lighted area, the young poet limping. Julio bears the canvas sack with difficulty, muttering, Pesante. Blackie, here you are. This is it. Now. Chris, what? Blackie, how are your legs? Mrs. Goforth keeps a doctor on the place, a resident physician, and I think he ought to come here and do a proper job on those dog bites. Chris, they're not that bad. Really. Blackie, have you had shots? Chris, shots? Blackie, for tetanus. Chris, yes, sometime or other. I'm actually just tired out. Blackie, Julio, see if the water is running in the bathroom. I'm sure you want to bathe before you rest, Mr. Flanders. Oh, no covers on the bed. Chris, don't bother about covers on it. Blackie, I think I have an idea you're going to sleep a good while, and you might as well sleep comfortably. Julio, covers for the bed. Julio, dove? Blackie, cerca nell'armadio del bagno. Julio goes out. Chris sits down on the foot of the narrow bed. His head falls forward. Mr. Flanders! He pulls himself up. Please try to stay awake till the bed's made up and you've bathed. Chris, your name is... He rises unsteadily. Blackie. Francis Black, called Blackie. Chris, how do you do? Mine's Flanders, Christopher Flanders. Julio enters. Julio, non se acqua. Blackie, well, tell your papa to turn the water on. Julio tosses some pink silk sheets on the bed and runs back out. I hope you don't mind camphor and the smell of camphor. He shakes his head slightly, holding on to a bedpost. The water ought to be running in a minute. Chris, I hope there's a shower. A tub wouldn't be safe for me. I don't think even drowning would wake me up. Blackie, I'll wait here till you've bathed. Chris, it's wonderful here after yesterday in Naples. Blackie, would you please get on the other side of the bed and help me spread these sheets? He staggers around the bed. They make it up. Chris, you... Blackie, what? Chris, I wonder if you're related to Mrs. Goforth or if you're... Blackie, not related. I'm working for Mrs. Goforth. Secretarial work. She's writing a sort of... All right, you can sit down now. She's writing her memoirs, and I'm helping her with it. The little, as best I can. He sinks back onto the bed and drops his head in his hands. Mr. Flanders, the water's turned on now. Chris, staggering up. Oh, good. Thank you. This way? Starts off. Blackie, I'll fill the tub for you. Do you want warm or cold water or... Chris, cold, please. Let me do it. Blackie, no, just stay on your feet till it's ready for you. She passes him and goes off. There's the sound of running water. He sits exhaustedly on the bed and sways. His forehead strikes the newel post, which is topped by a cupid. The room is full of painted and carved cupids. He looks up at the cupid on the post, shakes his head with a sad wry grimace, drops his head in his hands, and slumps over again. Blackie returns from the bathroom with a towel robe. She claps her hands. Blackie, I told you to stay on your feet. Chris, struggling up. Sorry, what is... I almost said, where am I? Blackie, here's a towel robe for you. You'd better just duck in and out. Chris, crossing to the door and looking back at her from the threshold. Is this called the Cupid Room? Blackie, I don't know if it's called that, but it should be. Chris, starting to leave, but on threshold. What a remarkable bathtub. It's almost the size of a deck pool on a steamship. Blackie, dryly. Yes, Mrs. Goforth thinks the bathtub should be built for at least 2 people. Chris entering. She must have been to Japan. Blackie. Yes, she probably owns it. Chris enters the bathroom. There is a splash, a loud gasp. Blackie. Oh, I should have warned you, it's mountain spring water. Chris. Does it come from a glacier? Blackie picks up the cords of his rucksack to drag it away from the bedside. She finds it startlingly heavy. She kneels beside it to loosen the drawstrings, draws out a silvery section of some metalwork. She rises guiltily as Chris reappears in the towel robe. Blackie. You're shivering. Chris. For exercise. Shivering's good exercise. Blackie. I don't think you need any more exercise for a while. How did you get this sack of yours up the mountain? Chris. Carried it from Genoa? Blackie. I could hardly drag it away from the bed. Chris. Yes, it's heavy with metal. I work in metal now. I construct mobiles, but it's not the mobiles that are heavy, it's the metalsmith tools. Blackie. You, sell mobiles, do you? Chris. No, mostly give 'em away. Of course I... Blackie. What? Chris. Some things aren't made to be sold. Oh, you sell them, but they're not made for that. Not for selling, they're made for... Blackie. Making them? Chris. Is there something buzzing in the room, or is the buzz in my head? Oh, a wasp. It'll fly back out the shutter. Is this a cigarette box? Opens box on small bedside table. Empty. Blackie. Have a nazionale. She offers him the pack. Chris. Thank you. Blackie. I'll leave the pack here. I have more in my room. Your hair's not dry, it's still wet. He shakes his head like a spaniel. Dry it with a towel and get right into bed. I have to get back to work now. I work here. I do secretarial work and I... Chris. Don't go right away. Blackie. You need to rest right away. Chris. The ice water woke me up. Blackie. Just temporarily, maybe. Chris. I'll rest much better if I know a bit more, such as, did Mrs. Goforth remember who I was? Blackie. I don't know about that, but she liked your looks, if that's any comfort to you. Chris. I didn't see her. She saw me? Blackie. She inspected you through a pair of military field glasses before she had me take you to the pink villa with the king-sized bathtub, the pink silk sheets, and the cupids. Chris. Do they, signify something? Blackie. Everything signifies something. I'll shut the shutters and you get into bed. She turns away from him. Chris, sitting on the bed. What is the program for me when I awake? Blackie, with her back still toward him. Don't you make out your own programs? Chris. Not when I'm visiting people. I try to adapt myself as well as I can to their programs when I'm visiting people. Blackie. Is that much of the time? Chris. Yes, that's most of the time. Blackie. Well, I think you're in for a while, if you play your cards right. You do want to be in, don't you? After hauling that sack all the way from Genoa and up this mountain to Mrs. Goforth? Or have the pink silk sheets and the cupid scared you, worse than the dogs you ran into? Chris. You have a sharp tongue, Blackie. Blackie. I'm sorry, but I was mistaken when I thought I had strong nerves. They're finished for today, if not for the season, for years. She starts away. Chris. Have a cigarette with me. He extends the pack to her. Blackie. You want to get some more information from me? Chris. I'd sleep better if I knew a bit more. Blackie. I wouldn't be too sure of that. Chris. I've been told, that Mrs. Goforth hasn't been well lately. Blackie laughs as if startled. Chris. She's lucky to have you with her. Blackie. Why? Chris. I can see you're sympathetic and understanding about Mrs. Goforth's condition, but not sentimental about it. Aren't I right about that? Blackie. I'm not understanding about it, and I'm afraid I've stopped being sympathetic. Mrs. Goforth is a dying monster. Rises. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Chris. No, not enough. Go on. Blackie. Why do you want to hear it? Chris. I've climbed a mountain and fought off a wolf pack to see her. Blackie. Why? Chris. Nowhere else to go now. Blackie. Well, that's an honest admission. Chris. Let's stick to honest admissions. Blackie. Sitting back down by the bed. All right. I'll give you something to sleep on. You'll probably wish I hadn't, but here it is. She eats nothing but pills, around the clock, and at night she has nightmares in spite of morphine injections. I rarely sleep a night through without an electric buzzer by my bed waking me up. I tried ignoring the buzzer, but found out that if I did, she'd come stumbling out of her bedroom onto the terrace, raving into a microphone that's connected to a tape recorder, stumbling about and raving her. Chris. Raving? Blackie. Yes. Her demented memoirs. Her memories of her career as a great international beauty, which she thinks she still is. I'm here, employed here, to take down and type up these... Chris. Memories? Blackie. That's enough for you now. Don't you think so? Chris. She doesn't know she's... Blackie. Dying? Oh no. Won't face it. Apparently never thought her legendary existence could go on less than forever. Insists she's only suffering from neuralgia, neuritis, allergies, and bursitis. Well, can you still sleep after this bedtime story? Chris. Blackie, I've had a good bit of experience with old dying ladies, scared to death of dying. Ladies with lives like Mrs. Goforth behind them, which they won't think are over. And I've discovered it's possible to give them, at least to offer them, something closer to what they need than what they think they still want. Yes. Would you please throw me the strings of my sack, Blackie? She tosses the strings to his bedside. He hauls the rucksack over, leans out of the bed to open it, removes a mobile. Give her this for me, Blackie. It took me 6 months to make it. It has a name, a title. It's called The Earth is a Wheel and a Great Big Gambling Casino. Music is heard playing softly. Blackie. The Earth is... Chris. A wheel in a great big gambling casino. I made it on hinges. It has to be unfolded before it's hung up. I think you'd better hang it up before you show it to her, if you don't mind. And in a place where it will turn in the wind, so it will make a more impressive impression. And this is for you, this book. He hands a book to her. Blackie. Poems? Chris. It's a verse adaptation I made of the writings of a Swami, a great Hindu teacher. My teacher. Oh, one thing more. I'd like to make a phone call to a friend, an invalid lady in Sicily. Taormina, a mountain above Taormina. Would Mrs. Goforth object if I... Blackie. Not if she doesn't know. What's the number? He gives her the number in Italian and is told that it will not go through for some time. There will be a delay. Is it very important? Chris. Yes, it is. She's dying. Blackie, you're the kindest person I've met in a long, long time. Blackie, drawing a sheet over him. This sort of thing is just automatic in women. Chris, only in some of them, Blackie. His eyes fall shut. Blackie, you're falling asleep. Chris, yes, automatic. Like kindness in some women. He drops his cigarette and she picks it up and crosses to the phone. Blackie, into the phone. Mariella, bring a tray of food up to the pink villa. Better make it cold things. The guest's asleep and won't wake up for hours. She hangs up, looks at Chris, and exits with book. Lights dim on this area, and a spot of light immediately picks up Mrs. Goforth on the terrace. The stage assistants have set a screen before this area, and the light is brought up on the forestage, which represents the terrace of the white villa. The stage assistants remove a wide screen, and we see Mrs. Goforth with two servants, Julio and Simonetta. Mrs. Goforth is preparing to take a sun bath on the terrace. Her appearance is bizarre. She has on a silk robe covered with the signs of the zodiac, and harlequin sunglasses with purple lenses. Mrs. Goforth, in her very pidgin Italian. Table here. Capito? Tabolo? Points. Chi? On tabolo. I want. What are you grinning at? Julio, very Neapolitan. Niente. Niente, ma scusa. He places table by chaise. Simonetta, giggling. Tabolo. Mrs. Goforth. On tabolo voglio. Una bottiglia da chi minare. San Pellegrino, capite? Molto giacata, capite? Simonetta giggles behind her hand at Julio's antic deference to the signora. Mrs. Goforth glares suspiciously from one to the other, turning from side to side like a bull wondering which way to charge. Blackie enters the terrace area with a mobile folded. Stronze, both of them. Blackie, you mustn't call them that. It has an insulting meaning. Mrs. Goforth. I know what it means, and that's what I want it to mean. That's what I mean it to mean. Generalissimo Vruri says they sleep together and carry on together some nights right here on my terrace. Blackie. They're from Naples, and Mrs. Goforth. What's that got to do with it? Blackie. And Generalissimo Rudy wants the girl for himself, so he... Mrs. Goforth. Will you please tell them what I want on the table by this chaise? Here. Blackie. What do you want on the table? Mrs. Goforth. I want a cold bottle of acqua minerale, cigarettes, matches, my Bain Soleil, my codeine and Empirin tablets, a shot of cognac on the rocks, the Paris Herald Tribune, the Rome Daily American, the Wall Street Journal, the London Times and Express, the... Hey, what did you do with the... Blackie, the visitor? Mrs. Goforth. The beatnik trespasser, yes. And what the hell have you got there that rattles like a string of boxcars crossing a rail yard switch? Blackie. The young man's in the pink villa, where you told me to put him. This is something he gave me for me to give to you. For me to give you. It seems like he constructs mobiles. Mrs. Goforth. Mobiles? Constructs? Blackie. Yes, those metal decorations. He gives them titles. This one's called The Earth is a Wheel in a Great Big Gambling Casino. Mrs. Goforth. Is it a present or something he hopes he can sell me? Blackie. It's a present. He wanted me to suspend it before you saw it, but since you've already seen it, shall I hang it up somewhere? Mrs. Goforth. No, just put it down somewhere and help me up. The sun is making me dizzy. I don't know why I came out here. What am I doing out here? Blackie. I was going to remind you that Dr. Ranguchi warned you not to expose yourself to the sun until the chest abscess, the lesion, has healed completely. Mrs. Goforth. I don't have a chest abscess. Stop putting bad mouth on me. Open the door. I'm going in the library. The stage assistants rush out and remove the screen masking that area as Mrs. Goforth starts toward it, lifting a hand like a Roman empress saluting the populace. Mrs. Goforth as she enters the library area. What did he have to say? Blackie. The Mrs. Goforth. Trespasser. What did he have to say? Blackie. About what? Mrs. Goforth. Me. Blackie. He wondered if you remembered him or not. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, I might have met him somewhere, sometime or other, when I was still meeting people, interested in it, before they all seemed like the same person over and over, and I got tired of the person. Blackie. This young man won't seem like the same person to you. Mrs. Goforth. That remains to be... Blackie, you know what I need to shake off this depression? What would do me more good this summer than all the shots and pills in the pharmaceutical kingdom? I need me a lover. Blackie. What do you mean by a lover? Mrs. Goforth. I mean a lover. What do you mean by a lover? Or is that a word outside your Vassar vocabulary? Blackie. I've only had one lover, my husband, Charles, and I lost Charles last spring. Mrs. Goforth. What beats me is how you could have a husband named Charles and not call him Charlie. I mean, the fact that you called him Charles and not Charlie describes your whole relationship with him, don't it? Blackie, flaring. Stop about my husband. Mrs. Goforth. The dead are dead, and the living are living. Blackie. Not so. I'm not dead, but not living. Mrs. Goforth. Julio? He has entered the library area with the mineral water. Vaal velino rosa e qui, the sack, el sacco, del aspotela. Blackie. Oh no, you mustn't do that. That's too undignified of you. Julio goes out to perform this errand. Mrs. Goldforth. Take care of your own dignity and let me take care of mine. It's a perfectly natural, legitimate thing to do, to go through the luggage of a trespasser on your place for possible weapons and so forth. She sits at the desk. Pencil, notebook, dictation. Blackie pays no attention to these demands but lights a cigarette behind Mrs. Goforth's back as she begins dictating. Season of 24. Costume ball at Cannes. Never mind the style now. Polish up later. Went as Lady Godiva. All of me, gilded. My whole body painted gold except for green velvet fig leaf. Breasts? Famous breasts? Nude. Nude completely. Astride a white horse led into the ballroom by a young guy. Correction. A Nubian slave boy. Appearance created a riot. Men clutched at my legs, trying to dismount me so they could mount me. Maddest party ever imaginable in those days of mad parties. This set the record for madness. In 29, so much ended, but not for me. I smelt the crash coming. Animal instinct. Very valuable asset. Put everything into absolutely indestructible utility such as tel electric power. Julio enters with a rucksack. Julio. Ecco el sacco. Drops it before Mrs. Goforth with a crash that makes her gasp. Blackie. May I be excused? I don't want to take part in this. Mrs. Goforth. Stay here. You heard that noise. That wasn't just clothes. That was metal. Blackie. Yes, I suppose he's come here to seize the mountain by force of arms. Mrs. Goforth to Julio. Julio, open, aprite. Julio opens the sack and the inspection begins. Blackie. I told you he made mobiles. The sack's full of metalsmith's tools. Mrs. Goforth. He hauled this stuff up the mountain? Blackie. It didn't fly up. Mrs. Goforth. He must have the back of a dray horse. Tell this idiot to hold the sack upside down and empty it all on the floor. He's taking things out like it was a Christmas stocking. Blackie. I'll do it. He'd break everything. She carefully empties the contents of the sack onto the floor. Mrs. Goforth. See if he's got any traveler's checks and how much they amount to. Blackie. Ignoring this order and picking up a book. He offered me this book. I forgot to take it. Mrs. Goforth, glaring at the book through her glasses. Meanings known and unknown. It sounds like something religious. Blackie. He says it's a verse adaptation he did of Mrs. Goforth. Swami something. See if you can locate the little book they always carry with names and addresses in it. Sometimes it gives you a clue to their backgrounds and inclination. Here. This is it. Snatches up an address book. Christ. Lady Emerald Fowler. She's been in hell for 10 years. Christabel Smithers. That name rings a long-ago church bell for a dead bitch, too. Mary Cole. Dead. Laurie Emerson. Dead. Is he a graveyard sexton? My God, where's his passport? Blackie, picking it up. Here. Mrs. Goforth. Date of birth. 1928. No chicken, Blackie. How old's that make him? Blackie. 35. She lights a cigarette. Mrs. Goforth snatches the cigarette from Blackie's hand. She sets it on the desk and in a moment starts smoking it herself. Mrs. Goforth. No traveler's checks whatsoever. Did he have some cash on him? Blackie. I don't know. I neglected to frisk him. Mrs. Goforth. Did you get him to bathe? Blackie. Yes. Mrs. Goforth. How'd he look in the bathtub? Blackie. I'm afraid I can't give you any report on that. Mrs. Goforth. Where's his clothes? No clothes? Niente vestiti in sacco? Julio produces one shirt, laundered but not ironed. Ecco una camicia, una bella camicia. Mrs. Goforth. One shirt? Blackie. He probably had to check some of his luggage somewhere in order to get up the goat path. And the clothes he had on were demolished by Rudy's dogs. Mrs. Goforth. Well, put a robe in his room. I know the samurai warrior's robe that Alex wore at breakfast. We always wore robes at breakfast in case we wanted to go back to bed right after. A stage assistant enters with an ancient Japanese robe with a belt and a sword attached. Blackie. Did he keep the sword on him at breakfast? Mrs. Goforth. Yes, he did. And sometimes he'd draw it out of the seat of the scabbard and poke me with it. Ho ho, tickle me with the point of it, ho ho ho. Blackie. You weren't afraid he'd accidentally... Mrs. Goforth. Sure. And it was exciting. I had me a little revolver too. I'd draw a bead on him sometimes and I'd say, You are too beautiful to live, and so you have to die. Now. Tonight. Tomorrow. The stage assistant hands the robe to Blackie, who accepts it without a glance at him. Put the robe in the pink velino and then call me the Witch of Capri. And then call the Witch of Capri. Blackie. Which witch? Mrs. Goforth. The one that wired me last month. Are you still living? Tell her I am. And get her over for dinner. Tell her it's urgentissimo. Everything's urgentissimo here this summer. Phone buzzes on desk. As Blackie starts off, Mrs. Goforth answers the phone. Pronto. Pronto, chi parla? Carmelina? Cecilia? I place no call to that place. She slams down the phone. The summer is coming to life. I'm coming back to life with it. She presses buttons on her intercom system. Electric buzzers sound from various points on the stage as the stage assistants cover the library area with the griffin-crested screen. The scene dims out. Scene 3. That evening. The setting is the terrace of the white villa and a small section of Mrs. Goforth's bedroom, upstage, left. In this scene, the stage assistants may double as butlers, with or without white jackets. At the curtain's rise, the two screens are lighted, one masking the small dinner table on the forestage, the other Mrs. Goforth. A stage assistant stands beside each screen so that they can be removed simultaneously when a cord provides the signal. The middle panel of Mrs. Goforth's screen is topped by a gold-winged griffin to signify that she is in residence behind it. Mrs. Goforth's voice, asthmatically. Simonetta la roba. Simonetta rushes behind the screen with an elaborate oriental costume. Attenzione, goddammit! Questa roba molto, molto valore. Va bene. Adesso parrucca. Wig. Simonetta emerging from the screen. A parrucca bionda? Mrs. Goforth. Nera. There is heard a reedy chord as on a harmonium. The screens are whisked away. In the stage left area, we see Mrs. Goforth in the oriental robe on the forestage, Rudy in his semi-military outfit pouring himself a drink, and a small section of balustrade on which is a copper brazier flickering with blue flame. Blackie enters, stage right, with a napkin and silver and sets a third place at the table. Rudy hovers behind her. Blackie. Stop breathing down my neck. Mrs. Goforth. Ecco. She puts on a black kabuki wig with fantastic ornaments stuck on it. Her appearance is gorgeously bizarre. As she moves out upon the forestage, there is oriental music. Well, no comment, Blackie? Blackie. The Witch of Capri has just gotten out of the boat and is getting into the funicular. Mrs. Goforth. You kill me, Blackie. You do. You literally kill me. I come out here in this fantastic costume and all you say is the Witch of Capri has landed. Blackie. I told you how fantastic it is when you wore it last weekend, when that Italian screen star didn't show up for dinner. So I didn't think it would be necessary to tell you again, but what I do want to tell you is that I wish you'd explain to Rudy that I find him resistible. And when I say resistible, I'm putting it as politely as I know how. Mrs. Goforth. What's Rudy doing to you? Blackie. Standing behind me, and Mrs. Goforth. You want him in front of you, Blackie? Blackie. I want him off the terrace while I'm on it. Mrs. Goforth. Rudy, you better go check my bedroom safe. These rocks I put on tonight are so hot they're radioactive. To Blackie. Guess what I'm worth on the hoof in this regalia? Blackie. I'm no good at guessing the value of Mrs. Goforth. I can't stand anything false. Even my kidney stones. If I had kidney stones, would be genuine diamonds fit for a queen's crown, Blackie. Blackie lights a cigarette. Takes the cigarette from her. A witch and a bitch always dress up for each other, because otherwise the witch would upstage the bitch, or the bitch would upstage the witch, and the result would be havoc. Blackie. Fine feathers flying in all directions? Mrs. Goforth. That's right. The witch has a fairly large collection of rocks herself, but no important pieces. She crosses, smoking, to the table. Hey, the table's set for 3. Are you having dinner with us? Blackie. Not this evening, thanks. I have to catch up on my typing. Mrs. Goforth. Then who's this third place set for? Blackie. The young man in the pink villa. I thought he'd be dining with you. Mrs. Goforth. That was presumptuous of you. He's having no meals with me till I know more about him. The Witch of Capri can give me the lowdown on him. In fact, the only reason I asked the witch to dinner was to get the lowdown on this mountain climber. The witch, at a distance. Yoo-hoo! Mrs. Goforth. Yoo-hoo! She won't be here more than a minute before she makes some disparaging comment on my appearance. Codeine, Emprin, brandy, before she gets here. She takes a morbid interest in the health of her friends because her own's on the downgrade. The witch, nearer. Yoo-hoo! Mrs. Goforth. Yoo-hoo! Here she comes. Here comes the witch. The Witch of Capri, the Marchesa Constance Ridgway Condotti, appears on the terrace. She looks like a creature out of a sophisticated fairy tale. Her costume like something that might have been designed for Fata Morgana. Her dress is gray chiffon, paneled, and on her blue-tinted head she wears a cone-shaped hat studded with pearls, the peak of it draped with the material of her dress. Her expressive claw-like hands are aglitter with gems. At the sight of Mrs. Goforth, she halts dramatically, opening her eyes very wide for a moment, as if confronted by a frightening apparition. Then she utters a dramatic little cry and extends her arms in a counterfeit gesture of pity. The witch. Sissy. Love. Mrs. Goforth. Connie. They embrace ritually and coolly, then stand back from each other with sizing up stares. The witch. Sissy, don't tell me we're having a Chinese dinner. Mrs. Goforth. This isn't a Chinese robe. It's a kabuki dancer's. A Japanese national treasure that Simon Willingham bought me on our reconciliation trip to Japan. It's only some centuries old. I had to sneak it through customs. Japanese customs, by wearing it tucked up under a chinchilla coat. You know I studied kabuki and got to be very good at it. I was a guest artist once at a thing for typhoon relief, and I can still do it, you see. She opens her lacquered fan and executes some kabuki dance movements, humming weirdly. The effect has a sort of grotesque beauty, but she is suddenly dizzy and staggers against the table. The witch utters a shrill cry. Blackie rushes to catch her and support the table. Mrs. Goforth tries to laugh it off. Haha, too much codeine. I took a little codeine for my neuralgia before you got here. The witch. Well, I'm suffering too. We're suffering together. Will you look at my arm? She draws up her flowing sleeve to expose a bandaged forearm. The sea is full of medusas. Mrs. Goforth. Full of what? The witch. Medusas. You know, those jellyfish that sting. The Latins call them medusas, and one of them got me this morning. A giant one. At the Piccolo Marina. I want a martini. I've got to stay slightly drunk to bear the pain. She tosses her parasol to Blackie and advances to the liquor cart. Sissy, your view is a meraviglia. Veramente una meraviglia. She drains a martini that Blackie pours her, then swings full circle and dizzily returns to a chair at the table. Do we have to eat? I'm so full of canapes from Mona's cocktail. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, is that what you're full of? We're having a very light supper, because the smell of food after codeine nauseates me, Connie. Blackie. Mrs. Goforth, shouldn't I take something to your house guest since he's not dining with you? Mrs. Goforth. No, meaning no. But you can leave us now, Blackie. Oh, excuse me, this is my secretary, Miss Black. Blackie, this is... What's your latest name, Connie? The witch. I mailed you my wedding invitation the spring before last spring to some hospital in Boston, the Lehigh Clinic, and never received a word of acknowledgement from you. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, weddings and funerals are the things you show up at, or you don't, according to where you are, and she rings bell for service. The stage assistants appear with white towels over their forearms or colored mess jackets. Note, although they sometimes take part in the action of the play, the characters in the play never appear to notice the stage assistants. Other circumstances. Have a gull's egg, Connie. The witch. No, thank you. I can't stand the gulls. Mrs. Goforth. Well, eating their eggs cuts down on their population. The witch. What is this monster of the deep? Mrs. Goforth. Dentice. Dentice Fredo. The witch. It has a horrid expression on its face. Mrs. Goforth. Don't look at it. Just eat it. The witch. Couldn't possibly, thank you. Mrs. Goforth. Are you still living on blood transfusions, Connie? That's not good. It turns you into a vampire. A pipistrella. Your neck's getting too thin, Connie. Is it true that you had a sheep embryo plantation in Switzerland? I heard. I don't approve of it. It keys you up for a while and then you collapse completely. The human system can't stand too much stimulation after 60. The witch. What did they find out at the La Haye clinic, sissy? Mrs. Goforth. Oh, that. That was just a little routine checkup. The witch. When you called me today, I was so relieved I could die. Shouted hallelujah silently to myself. I'd heard such distressing rumors about you lately, sissy. Mrs. Goforth. Rumors? Hell, what rumors? The witch. Crossing to the bar cart for a refill. I can't tell you the rumors that have been circulating about you since your house party last month. The ones you brought over from Capri came back to Capri with stories that I love you too much to repeat. Mrs. Goforth. Repeat them, Connie. Repeat them. The witch. Are you sure you feel well enough to take them? She returns to her chair. Well, they said that you seemed to be off your rocker. They said you spent the whole night shouting over loudspeakers so nobody could sleep, and that what you shouted was not to be believed. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, how nice of them, Connie. Capri's turned into a nest of vipers, Connie, and the sea is full of medusas? The medusas are spawned by the bitches. You want to know the truth behind the gossip, or would you rather believe a pack of malicious inventions? The witch. You know I love you, sissy. What's the truth? Mrs. Goforth. Not that. I'll tell you the truth. She rises and indicates the intercom speaker. I'm writing my memoirs this summer. I've got the whole place wired for sound, a sort of very elaborate intercom or walkie-talkie system, so I can dictate to my secretary, Blackie. I buzz my secretary any time of the day and night and continue dictating to her. That's the truth. The true story. She goes over to the witch taking her hand. I'm so glad you told me, sissy love. Mrs. Goforth. Has it ever struck you, Connie, that life is all memory, except for the one present moment that goes by you so quick you hardly catch it going? It's really all memory, Connie, except for each passing moment. What I just now said to you is a memory now. Recollection. She paces to the terrace. I'm up now. When I was at the table is a memory now. She arrives at the edge of the lighted area downstage right and turns. When I turned at the other end of the terrace is a memory. Now. The witch gets up and goes toward her. Practically everything is a memory to me now, so I'm writing my memoirs. She points up. Shooting star. It's shot. A memory now. 4 husbands. All memory now. All lovers. All memory now. The witch. So you're writing your memoirs. Mrs. Goforth. Devoting all of me to it and all of my time. At noon today, I was dictating to Blackie on a tape recorder. The beautiful part of my life, my love with Alex, my final marriage. Alex, the witch going to the bar cart. Oh, the young Russian dancer from the Diaghilev troupe? Mrs. Goforth, returning to her chair. Oh, God, no. I never married a dancer. Slept with a couple, but never married one. They're too narcissistic for me. They love only mirrors. Nope. Alex was a young poet with a spirit that was as beautiful as his body. The only one I married that wasn't rich is Croesus. Alex made love without mirrors. He used my eyes for his mirrors. The only husband I've had, of the 6 I've had, that I could make love to with a bright light burning over the bed. 100-watt bulbs overhead. To see while we loved. The witch, going back to the table with a pitcher of martinis. Are you dictating this over a loudspeaker? Mrs. Goforth. Oh, God, Alex. The witch. Are you in pain? Do you have a pain in your chest? Mrs. Goforth. Why? The witch. You keep touching your chest. Mrs. Goforth. Emotion. I've been very emotional all day. At noon today, a young poet came up the goat path from the highway just as I was in the emotional throes of dictating my memories of young Alex. The witch, draining her martini. Aha! Mrs. Goforth. He came up the goat path from the Amalfi Drive wearing lederhosen like Alex was wearing the first time I set eyes on him. The witch, starting to pour another martini. Aha! Mrs. Goforth, snatching the pitcher from the witch and placing it on the floor. Do you want to hear this story? The witch. Liquor improves my concentration. Go on. You've met a new poet. What was the name of this poet? Mrs. Goforth. His name was on the book. The witch. Yes, sometimes they do put the author's name on a book. Mrs. Goforth, unamused. Sanders? No. Manders? No. The witch. Flanders. Christopher Flanders. Makes large eyes. Is he still in circulation? Mrs. Goforth. I don't know if he's in circulation or not, but I do know he came up here to see me, and not by the boat and funicular. The witch, moving toward Mrs. Goforth. Well, God help you, sissy. Mrs. Goforth. Why? Is something wrong with him? The witch. Not if you're not superstitious. Are you superstitious? Mrs. Goforth. What's superstition got to do with? The witch. I've got to have a wee drop of brandy on this. She crosses over to the bar cart. This is really uncanny. Mrs. Goforth. Well, come out with it. What? The witch, selecting the brandy bottle. I think I'd rather not tell you. Mrs. Goforth, commandingly. What? The witch. Promise me not to be frightened? Mrs. Goforth. When have I ever been frightened? Of what? Not even that stiletto you've got for a tongue can scare me. She downs her own martini at a gulp. So what's the witch? Chris. Poor Chris Flanders. He has the bad habit of coming to call on a lady just a step or two ahead of the undertaker. She sits down. Last summer, at Portofino, he stayed with some Texas oil people. And at supper one night, that wicked old Duke of Parma, you know the one that we call the Parma Violet, he emptied a champagne bottle on Christopher's head, and he said, I christen thee, Christopher Flanders, the angel of death. The name has stuck to him, sissy. Why, some people in our age bracket were senior citizens, sissy, would set their dogs on him if he entered their grounds. But since you're not superstitious, why isn't he dining here with us? I wanted some information about him before the witch. Let him stay here? Mrs. Goforth. He's here on probation. She rings for Julio and then crosses center. I put him in the pink villa where he's been sleeping since noon, when he climbed up a goat path to see me. The witch, following Mrs. Goforth. I hope he's not playing his sleeping trick on you, sissy. Mrs. Goforth. Trick? Sleeping? The witch. Yes. Last summer when he was with that Portofino couple from Texas, they were thrown into panic when they heard his nickname, Angel of Death, and told him that night to check out in the morning. Well, that night he swallowed some sleeping pills that night, sissy. But of course he took the precaution of leaving an early morning call so he could be found and revived before the pills could... Mrs. Goforth abruptly begins to leave. Where you going, sissy? Mrs. Goforth. Follow me to the pink villa. Hurry. Hurry. I better make sure he's not playing that trick on me. She rushes off. The witch laughs wickedly as she follows. The stage assistants immediately set a screen before this acting area and the light dims. Then they remove a screen upstage, and we see Chris asleep in the pink villa. A lullaby, perhaps the Brahms one, is heard. Mrs. Goforth and the witch appear just on the edge of the small lighted area. Mrs. Goforth. Everything's pink in this villa, so it's called the Pink Villa. The witch. I see. That's logical, sissy. There he is, sleeping. Mrs. Goforth, in a shrill whisper as they draw closer to the bed. Can you tell if he's... The witch removes her slippers, creeps to the bedside and touches his wrist. Well? The witch. Hush. She slips back to Mrs. Goforth. You're lucky, sissy. His pulse seems normal. He's sleeping normally, and he has a good color. She slips back to the bed and bends her face to his. Let me see if there's liquor on his breath. No. It's sweet as a baby's. Mrs. Goforth. Don't go to bed with him. The witch. No, that's your privilege, sissy. Mrs. Goforth, moving downstage from the lighted area in the follow spot. Come out here. The witch, reluctantly following. You must have met him before. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, somewhere, sometime when I was still meeting people, before they all seemed like the same person over and over and I got tired of the person. The witch. You know his story, don't you? The stage assistants place a section of balustrade at an angle beside them, and a copper brazier with the blue flame in it. The flame flickers eerily on the witch's face as she tells what she knows of Chris. Music plays against her stylized recitation. Sally Ferguson found him at a ski lodge in Nevada where he was working as a ski instructor. Mrs. Goforth. A poet? A ski instructor? The witch. Everything about him was like that. A contradiction. He taught Sally skiing at this Nevada lodge where Sally was trying to prove she was a generation younger than she was, and thought she could get away with it. Well, she should have stuck to the gentle slopes, since her bones had gone dry. But one day she took the ski lift to the top of the mountain, drank a hot buttered rum, and took off like a wild thing. A crazy bird down the mountain, slammed into a tree and broke her hip bone. Well, Christopher Flanders carried her back to the ski lodge. We all thought she was done for, but Chris worked a miracle on her that lasted for quite a while. He got her back on her pins after they'd pinned her broken hip together with steel pins. They traveled together, to and from Europe together. But then one time in rough weather, on the promenade deck of one of the Queen ships, the Mary, he suddenly let go of her. She took a spill and her old hip bone broke again, too badly for steel pins to pin her back together again. and Sally gave up her travels except from one room to another, on a rolling couch pushed by Chris. We all advised her to let Chris go, like Chris had let go of her on the promenade deck of the Mary. Would she? Never. She called him my saint, my angel, till the day she died. And her children contested her will so that Chris got nothing, just his poems published, dedicated to Sally. The book won a prize of some kind, and Vogue and Harper's Bazaar played it up big with lovely photos of Chris looking like what she called him, an angel, a saint. Mrs. Goforth. Did he sleep with that old Ferguson bitch? Or was he just her death angel? The phone rings on the bedside table. The area has remained softly lighted. Chris starts up, drops back, feigning sleep as Mrs. Goforth rushes to the phone and snatches it up. Pronto, dica. Termino, Sicily? No. Shagliato. Mrs. Goforth looks with angry suspicion at Chris, who murmurs as if in sleep. She notices the food tray by the bed and snatches it up, then returns to the witch downstage. He's already making long-distance calls on the phone. And look at this. He's had them bring him food. He's had them bring him a food tray, and I'm going to remove it. I can't stand guests, especially not invited, that act like they're in a hotel, charging calls and calling for room service. Come on, I'm turning out the lights. The witch. My slippers. She slips back to the bed and picks up her slippers, lingering over Chris. Suddenly, she bends to kiss him on the mouth. He rolls over quickly, shielding his lower face with an arm and uttering a grunt of distaste. Possum. The lights dim in the area as the witch moves down. Mrs. Goforth has disappeared. Sissy? Yoo-hoo! Mrs. Goforth from a distance. Yoo-hoo! The witch following. Yoo-hoo! The stage assistants replace the screen that masked the pink villa bed. Then they fold and remove the screen before Blackie's bed in the blue villa. The area remains dark until a faint dawn light appears on the cyclorama. Then Blackie's bed is lighted, and we see her seated on it, brushing her dark hair with a silver-backed brush. The scene dims out.